Hey all. So today we're going to talk about a fairly dense topic. I'm going to try and make it as approachable as possible. If it's starting to bounce off you, feel free to step away, come back. Don't worry about that. I know math isn't for everybody, but if you clicked on this, you're probably curious. You're probably at least a little bit of a nerd, and you probably want to know how this works. So, gonna try and clarify some of that. First thing to understand is that each damage event in our game has several steps that I think are most helpful to process separately from each other, because then you understand that these will all multiply on each other, but each step is on its own. And that just makes things a lot clearer when you're trying to figure out, okay, exactly how much is this going to do for me? Is this 40% that I'm looking at actually 40% more or less damage? Or is it getting added together with something else, and does it end up being more like a 10% increase? That's what we're talking about today. So the first thing to understand in that chain is what your attack rating is right now. So your base attack is the most important number, and this changes with very, very few things. Your base attack changes with the rank and rarity of your character, and it changes with ascension. If you're dealing with a 6-star that is ascended, then their base attack will be increased. So I'll say here, even though it's a pretty big statement, very nearly all damage in the game scales with base attack. Unless it's specifically looking for a chunk of health, right? It's probably scaling with the base attack of one champion or another. Now, it might scale with modified attack too, which I realize is starting to get confusing. But by that I simply mean that modified attack itself scales with base attack, right? Whatever the final modification is, if base attack goes up or down, so does the final number. I'm clarifying this point because I remember when Ascension was new, there were a lot of questions, and I still see them occasionally, about does this number go up with Ascension? And if it's about damage, right, which means if it's tied to attack, then the answer is yes, because Ascension increases base attack, and base attack increases everything else, right? Like I said, unless it is explicitly tied to health, it's going to be tied to base attack. Now, some things scale only with base attack, such as Galen's burst damage or Mysterio's poisons. But for most things, we can move on to this next part, which is attack modifications, right? And so your modified attack is going to be the combination of these next two steps. First, we have Furies and similar effects, right? Which are just going to increase your attack by a percentage of your base attack. There are a couple things in games still that do incorrectly say that they increase attack by a percentage of modified attack. That is not a thing. I know of at least one place where it did exist not too long ago, but that is broken for a lot of reasons, right? Because let's imagine the simplest possible case for this, right? You have a character with a base attack of 100, and they gain a 10% fury. If that scaled with modified attack, then even if that fury had a stack limit of 1, then when they gained it again while the first one was still active, instead of being 10 points, that new fury would be 11 points. And the next one would be 12, and so on. That's how exponents work, right? And so that it would not be healthy for the game. So because of that, anything that's increasing attack rating is going to be a percentage of base attack. So if you see a 20% fury, it doesn't matter what your modified attack is right now, it only matters what your base attack is. You can have a base attack of 100, And a modified attack of 300, a 20% fury is still only going to be 20 more points. And that's really important to process, right? Because there are a lot of things in this game that add attack rating. And it's important to note that adding a percentage of attack rating like that is less effective on characters that have other attack modifications, right? Because it's always going off that base, not the modified value. This is why, just to use one example, using attack boosts on someone like Hulkling, who has huge Furies in his kit, is less effective than using those attack boosts on somebody like Kitty Pryde, who has no attack modifications in her kit. Now, after all of those attack increases, all of the Furies and pseudo-Furies are added up, then you process weakness, right? So I've written out some math here. I realize if you didn't enjoy your high school math classes, maybe lightly triggering, but the weakness calculation is really pretty simple, right? Let's imagine that this is three 10% weaknesses. So that would be 1 minus 0.1 for each of these. All that matters there is that you're taking the modified attack after, base plus all of the positive modifiers, and you are multiplying that total by 90%, by 90%, by 90% for those three 10% weaknesses. If you had a 10, a 15, and a 20% weakness, then you'd be multiplying by 0.9, then by 0.85, then by 0.8, right? And so on. Now, it's important to note that weakness is capped at 90%, so this step cannot reduce attack further than to 10% of the subtotal from the step above this, right? But that is how you get your final attack rating. You have base attack, and then that is additively increased by percentages of base attack. And then that running subtotal is multiplied exponentially by weakness to make it smaller again. And then that is your final value. This is why the inequity mastery is so powerful, because it is functionally a weakness, right? Anyone with strong weakness effects, meaning anyone who can max out the inequity mastery, characters like Yondu, Immortal Abomination, have access to an incredible amount of effective damage reduction, because it doesn't matter how high the opponent's modified attack is getting from all of their Furies, the weaknesses apply to the whole thing. Alright, so that's step 1. Moving on to step 2, this is a part that we often don't really talk about, right? But the next step is your hit multiplier. The easiest way to understand this, I think, is looking at specials, right? By default, most characters' special ones deal 100% of their modified attack split up over all the hits of that special. You can check Aunt May or Kongachu's Ankh for these numbers, or you can measure them yourselves if you want, but then things get complicated quickly. But the base damage of most characters' special ones is just their current attack rating split up through the hits. This becomes very simple if you're looking at somebody like Deadpool, who just has a single hit special one. The base damage for that hit, if it's not a crit, if there's no armor involved, etc., is just Deadpool's attack, which makes things pretty clean. But that step works for all other hits in the game too. For your special 2, there is a multiplier of your modified attack that gets distributed through all the hits of the special 2. The special 3 obviously is its own unique beast and counts as a single hit, but that's how the base damage for the special 3 is calculated too. But this also applies to basics. Now, most of the time, you're getting a single smaller percentage of your modified attack for like a light attack, say. But the same logic holds if you have a double hit light, right? It's going to be that percentage of modified attack distributed through all the hits of the event. So if two characters have the same modified attack, one of them has a single hit light, the other one has a double light, they're going to deal the same total damage, but the second character is going to split that damage up between the two hits of the light. Now, I titled this part hit/dot multiplier because I think it is helpful to also understand damaging effects as part of this stage. And that is because most damaging effects are built as a percentage of modified attack, right? When you see Black Panther inflicts a bleed that deals this much damage, the way that is coded is a set percentage of modified attack, right? And then that's distributed through the base duration of the event. Very similar to how hits work. The reason why it's helpful to think about that in this step is that for damage events, this is also where potency modifications live, right? If you're facing somebody who reduces bleed damage by 90%, that's going to attack it at this step right here. A bleed that would have dealt 100 damage based on its percentage of modified attack is going to get locked in the game's architecture as instead dealing 10 by that kind of resistance. And I'm really underscoring this because this is a separate step from when physical and energy resist happen later, right? And I see a lot of confusion about that difference because they are both colloquially called resistance. And I understand that's confusing. I would change it if I could. But that is the difference, right? When you are talking about, quote, resistance to a damaging effect type, takes 90% less damage from bleed, takes 100% less damage from cold snap, takes 60% less damage from poison. All of those live here where the multiplier is calculated. Physical and energy we'll get to later. It's also important to note while we are talking about damaging effects that duration modifications happen after this step, right? That's why Deep Wounds is so strong, for those of you who don't know, because for something like Nick Fury's bleed on his 4th light attack, a very potent bleed is calculated with a short duration, and then that's what each tick of the bleed does, right? It's distributed over the base duration. Each additional half second, each additional tick is going to deal that same amount of damage again. That's why Deep Wounds is so incredibly good for short bleeds, right? It's also why someone like Ultron, or even Angela before she gets to 100% duration reduction, is so good at dealing with damaging events because the full damage is calculated and then they just lop off part of the duration. But to bring this back to hit events, this is also where prowess lives for special attacks, right? Now it's important that prowess modifies the total multiplier for a special attack, right? So for many characters, again, you can see this measured on websites, the total damage for a special 2 is 240% of modified attack split up among the hits of that special 2. A 100% prowess doubles that. And now the special 2 deals 480% of modified attack, right? That's very important because prowess is very strong, right? A 50% prowess means that the base hit damage of all of your specials goes up by 50%. That is multiplicative. But then prowess itself is additive with each other. A 100% prowess plus a 100% prowess means that you're getting a 200% increase or triple damage. It does not mean that you are doubling twice for times 4 damage. Additionally, as of the recent build, prowess is still subject to cowardice the same way that fury is to weakness, right? All of those prowess modifications are added up, and then cowardice is added onto the total multiplicatively, the exact same way we talked about weakness math in the previous slide. So we've already been talking for a while, but kind of zooming out, the important part here is that these first two steps are isolating your attack rating and then figuring out how much of your attack rating the base damage of your damage event is, whether that is a hit event or a damaging effect. Last comment before we move on, I also want to call out any damaging effects that say percentage of damage dealt, such as Hercules' strength damage or a trauma effect, etc. Those are not directly tied to attack. They're indirectly tied to attack because when their damage is calculated, also at this step, it is directly reading the hit damage that just happened, which itself was decided by modified attack, but in this stage, they are not themselves listening for attack. So just to clarify that. Now, moving on to critical damage. Once the base damage of a hit is decided, then critical damage rating comes into play. We are not going to talk about so-called critical dots in this stage because the implementation of them has not been perfectly consistent, and therefore it's just going to get confusing. So we'll just say those are strong and leave them off to the right, okay? Here we are just talking about hit events. And in that sense, again, I don't really want to get into the true math here because critical damage math in our game is bluntly pretty confusing. I'll admit I had to double check our wiki before recording this to make sure I didn't misspeak. But the important part is that it respects diminishing returns, right? You can have a bunch of different sources of critical damage rating. They are all going to add together as flat values, right? You're going to get like 800 critical damage rating from this, 50 critical damage rating from this, blah, blah, blah. That's going to spit out a total that is then fed into a diminishing returns curve that's going to kind of bring down the effect, right? The more critical damage rating you have, the less each additional point is worth. That's the diminishing returns part, right? Each marginal increase is worth less. But on the way there, it is important to note that the first few sources of critical damage rating can be huge. And at the end of all of that, you are going to have a percentage that is calculated by the game. And then that is fed through a formula I don't want to get into right now, but that multiplies your base damage from your hit and gives you your critical damage for a hit. Obviously, this is only for hits that are critical, right? This is still usually not the yellow number you will see because almost all characters have at least some armor. So we'll talk about that in the next step. But again, I'm going to call this your base critical damage for the hit. This is also the step at which flat damage is added. If that doesn't ring any bells for you, that's fine because it's extremely rare. There are very, very few characters or synergies that use flat damage at all, but perhaps the most famous is Sunspot, right? When he has those solar flare charges, they are increasing the damage of his basic attacks by a flat amount, which means the hit damage is calculated, whether it's a crit or not, and then just a flat chunk, a percentage of his modified attack is added onto it. So that's an important point. When this damage is calculated, it's usually still tied to modified attack. So it respects that first step, but it basically skips the critical damage part, right? It skips the critical damage, it skips the hit multiplier steps, and then is just tacked on here at the end of the critical damage step so that you make sure you have it before you head into armor and resistances. It's a little weird, but hopefully that helps you understand Sunspot, Elsa's Sig. Kushala has this in a synergy with Longshot and Sunspot. That's where I got the inspiration from as well. But it's a pretty rare effect. Most of the time, you just need to understand this step as after the hit damage is calculated, then if it's a crit, it gets bigger. So next step, armor and resistance. Important reminder here, armor only applies to hit damage. It applies to all hit damage, including special 3s. It's very powerful in that sense. Because of this next point, resistance is only for typed damage. Physical resistance applies to physical damage. Energy resistance applies to energy damage. While we're on the topic, the special 3 is not typed. The special 3 technically deals direct damage by default. But the special 3 does not deal true damage. The special 3 deals direct damage that is subject to armor. Which is weird, but if you're trying to figure out why your special 3 is doing more or less than you expected, that's probably why. But for most attacks, armor affects your hit damage. Resistance, one or the other, is going to affect most hit damage, but then resistance also affects a lot of dot damage, right? Physical resistance is going to affect your ruptures, your corrosions, your traumas, your reverbs. Energy resistance is going to affect shocks, incinerates, much longer list, right? I've talked about this before, but just as a small aside, this is also why resistance is so strong as a defense against effects like trauma or reverb. Because the resistance will blunt the damage of the hit itself, and then in a separate damage event, right? Because that's the important thing, is something like overload or trauma is effectively two of these flowcharts we're talking about. There's the hit, and then there's the burst damage. And resistance will get a chance to affect both of those events. First the hit damage, then the red number. And the red number will be based on the hit damage, so you get a multiplying effect there. But that's kind of a niche case. Most of the time, the important thing to know about armor and resistance is that they are combined together before diminishing returns kicks in. That may come as a surprise for a lot of people, but this has a really big effect on how armor breaks and energy and physical vulnerabilities work too. Because it means that for a hit, if your armor is low enough, that can cancel out resistance, and vice versa. If your energy resist is being reduced by enough when you get hit by an energy hit, it may not matter that you have armor, because that armor may be canceled out by the reduced energy resist. This is also why Pierce is such a powerful effect, and is a big component in how strong Hulkling is as an attacker. Now that is technically armor penetration, which is not quite the same thing as armor reduction. It's not supposed to be able to take armor negative. I think there's some weirdness there that we're just not going to get into. But the important part here is that anything that attacks armor is also effectively attacking resistance and vice versa. It's very important for understanding how damage is getting multiplied. So once these flat values for armor, up or down, and resistance, again up or down, are combined, you get this total damage reduction number, right? Then, if that number is positive, it is fed through diminishing returns to make sure that you are not zeroing out incoming damage. Notice that I said if it's positive. If it's not, it's actually not fed through diminishing returns, which is why large armor breaks, large vulnerability effects are so effective. because they are calculated in the first place using the diminishing returns curve, meaning that they can get very, very big, but then they are not subject to that diminishing returns curve if they are taking the damage resistance negative. They will actually just multiply the damage by a very large factor. That's why somebody like Cosmic Ghost Rider is so strong. That's why Absorbing Man's vulnerabilities make his red numbers so big. It's this factor here. To touch on damaging effects, this is, again, where energy and physical resistance come into play. So like I said back in the multiplier portion, that's where resistance to individual damaging effects comes into play. If somebody has a 50% resistance to shock, which we are normally going to communicate as takes 50% less damage from shock effects, and then they also have 50% energy resistance, those are in two different steps of this flowchart, and so they're multiplicative with each other. Because you're going to get, let's say the shock deals 100 damage in a tick, right? That's going to get hit by 50% in the potency calculation, and then in a separate step by a multiplicative 50% energy resist. So you're still going to take 25 damage from that shock, right? They're separate steps, so they're not additive with each other, they're multiplicative with each other. Now, for most damage in the game, this is the final step of the calculation. But the last one comes up enough that we should talk about it. So damage reduction and increase is separate from all that armor and resistance, right? This is another multiplicative step. This refers to when you see things like takes 90% less damage from all sources, right? Takes blah 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 more damage from all sources, takes more damage from champions. That's this effect, right? So I've listed a few examples here. The Vigor effect in the Ares fight or in the Thor relic is a damage increase in this step. The Protection effect as you see it in like Ebb and Flow Knockdown or Make a Stand or Sasquatch's Rage Stacks, those are all damage reduction from this step. It's important to note that this is not actually how Thing's protection works. He's old and weird and is kind of lying to you, and I'm not going to get into all the specifics here, but just if you're getting confused by him behaving differently, that's why. And then this is also the kind of tech that's being used in like wounded phases for bosses, right? Nameless Grandmaster, Citalis, etc. Any of those bosses that go into a wounded phase and take more damage from all sources while wounded, that's this step 2. And I have down here at the end, the buck stops here because, yeah, this is the last modification of damage. This is kind of the most powerful thing. If you are taking 90% less damage from all sources, then they mean it, right? No matter what happened in the 4 steps before this, boom, 90% less. It's one of the reasons Sasquatch has been such an enduring defender, because he has this in his kit, right? Thanos, Deathless Thanos, has this in his kit. It's very powerful. We have to pay attention to it. But it is also additive with itself, right? And so this is an important thing to note too. It's one of the reasons we've been so precious with Vigor, because it can actually get around this. If you haven't noticed this yet, if you are using the Thor relic and you have a 10% Vigor on you, which means that your opponent is taking 10% more damage from you, and your opponent has a 100% protection on them, you will still deal 10 damage. Because the damage is getting reduced by 100, and then the 100 is being additively reduced to 90, right? Let's use perhaps a more common example of that. Let's say you're fighting somebody on Make a Stand 3, which reduces damage by 90% except for a window after a knockdown. A 10% Vigor would double your damage on that node, because instead of dealing 10%, you'd be dealing 20%. You'd effectively be reducing the potency of the protection by having vigor. Again, very, very strong effect precisely because it lives here at the end of the calculations. So, let's go through an example. I'm calling this a simple example because I'm intentionally keeping all of the numbers pretty clean, but I'm going to make sure there's a modification in every single part of the step, so it's not going to feel that simple. Let's get into it. Let's say a character has 5,000 base attack, right? And then a 20% fury, and then 3 5% weaknesses. That's going to be 5,000 times 1.2. So you're up to 6,000 attack, and then times 0.95 3 times, right? Because that's how you calculate the weaknesses. Each one of those 5% weaknesses is 1 minus 0.05, and then you multiply that by that 6,000 attack. So that gets us down to 5,144 attack. All right, now let's imagine we are looking at the damage dealt by a standard Special 2. Special 2s, like I said earlier, often deal 240% of that attack there. So we're going to multiply 5,144 times 2.4. That means that this special without prowess would have a base damage of 12,346 spread out among all of its hits. For simplicity's sake, let's say this Special 2 has a single big hit. Now let's add a 50% prowess. That's just going to multiply this damage we have so far by 1.5. So we're now up to a base hit damage of 18,500. Let's say this hit crits. And let's say that after we run through the weirdness with diminishing returns, that crit deals 2.5 times as much damage, which is a fairly standard multiplier. We're now up to this Special 2 has landed a big yellow number of 46,300. Or at least it's trying to, because we haven't looked at armor and resist yet, right? Now, again, I'm not going to get super nitty-gritty with diminishing returns math. I know that instantly puts people to sleep. But let's just look at this 20% armor, this 40% physical resist that we're imagining for this physical hit of a Special 2. And let's know that as they are added together, they get smaller. Now, I've been working with diminishing returns enough that I intuitively know that 20% armor plus 40% physical resist is probably going to wind up somewhere in between a 50 and 55% total reduction, short of that 60% that it would imply, right? So for simplicity's sake, let's just call it a 50% damage reduction. So you might think, okay, well then that means that 46,000 gets cut in half, right? Except, one thing we haven't talked about yet, by default, critical hits ignore 80% of armor and resistances. So instead of reducing our damage by 50% total, the armor and resist reduces the damage of this critical hit by only 10%, 20% of that 50, right? If this hit hadn't crit, then our original pre-crit number of 18,500 would be reduced by half, down to 9,000, right? But our 46,000 crit is only getting reduced by 10% to 4,100. And then lastly, let's assume that there's a 20% protection on our incoming physical damage, right? So this is its own separate step. So it's not additive with the armor and resistance reduction we just did. We instead multiply by 1 minus that protection potency. And so we multiply that 4,100 damage we had by 0.8. So the final big yellow number that we would expect from this particular chain of circumstances would be 33,334. And you can see how it gets very complicated very quickly, right? That was a lot of numbers, that was a lot of steps, even with me intentionally picking simple numbers and skipping over a couple things. But hopefully things are a bit more clear now. This is the kind of video that, if you want to, I want you to be able to watch back again later. I hope that the example helped. I hope the explanations helped. Let me know in the comments if this makes damage in our game feel at all less mysterious. I realize it is still complicated. There's no getting away from that. There are a lot of overlapping, interlocking systems in our game, and I do think that is what gives it its depth. But it can make discussions like this quickly get out of hand. And my goal with this video was to make those discussions a bit more accessible. So again, let me know what you're thinking in the comments. And until next time, thank you so much for watching, and take care.